So, to carry on with the lecture from earlier, repercussions of crisis. The first thing I would like to say about that is to recognise that the social repercussions of crisis have been immense. In the United States particularly, loss of houses, loss of homes, as a result of the fact that people's mortgages were unsustainable, as I said in a lecture. But then more broadly throughout most of the Western world, certainly Europe and America, massive amounts of increases in unemployment. And relatedly, because of the pressure of crisis, people having their incomes squeezed and their working hours increased, and generally feeling more insecure about their jobs. And of course, one of the ways in which governments have dealt with the crisis is to cut expenditure. Very often to cut expenditure specifically on things that we might describe as being public goods or social services. And governments have become increasingly anxious about holding debt. Levels of indebtedness have been very high in a lot of Western states. That's certainly true, but how those levels of indebtedness have been handled raises very explicit political issues, and most governments have decided to axe public services and to cut back on, as I say, things that we would associate with public services. Things like Sure Start in the United Kingdom, for example. So there's been a real increase in social hardship as a result of crisis. And one of the arguments that political economists have made about this is that crisis is a powerful word because it allows governments to dress up or represent unpleasant policy decisions as necessary or even inevitable. And one of the contrasts that one might consider in relation to that is the alacrity and generosity of government support for financial institutions, for banks essentially. It's remarkable how much money has been made available through drawing new credit and through mobilising existing resources for banks, on the basis that large banks who have, if you like, exposure in a whole series of different markets, retail, housing, lending to business, how governments have actually been very generous in trying to put money into those banks to refinance so-called toxic assets. So the basic idea is, if there is a bank that has been buying up a lot of subprime loans or other assets that have proven to be insecure or never able to be called back, if you like, to put money into those institutions so they can effectively buy them off, to write them off. It's quite difficult to get proper total numbers on exactly how much money governments have put into these kinds of packages. Some people estimate that about 80% of Britain's gross domestic product, its total income, if you like, has been dedicated to one or other kind of rescue package. That's a remarkable figure. The United States has had a number of billion and even in total trillion-dollar rescue packages, probably the best known of which is the Troubled Assets Relief Programme. Layer upon layer, in fact, of billion-dollar, billion-pound rescue packages. Which leads us to the third sort of significant repercussion, the rise in social protest. As a moral argument, there's a lot to be said for a basic relationship between finance and ordinary taxpayers, what the United States tends to call the middle class, and what in the UK we often think of as the ordinary working people. Both of these groups can be defined partly as taxpayers. And of course, one of the kind of key revenue sources for governments remains income tax and other kinds of tax that come from ordinary people, if you like, people who work for a living or people who contribute regularly to government at local and central level. So it's not very difficult to imagine how actually there's a very, very substantial process of redistribution going on under the guise of crisis, in which ordinary people are paying taxes into governments and then finding that governments are paying large amounts of money into asset relief and rescue packages, to a degree that when people lose their jobs, find that their social services are being cut, find it morally very vexing and indeed just plainly unjust to discover governments announcing such huge rescue packages to banks, who continue to perform very badly in many ways. There remain a whole series of allegations about fraud. There is a fairly obvious lack of positive reaction by most banks to their own asset reflation. Having received larger influxes of money, big banks, and even when nationalised, big banks remain very risk averse and very unwilling to start to lend money to either homeowners or to businesses. Hence, we are remaining in recession. There's no obvious sign of green shoots, as people say. There are moments where developed capitalist economies look as if they may recover, but I think most economists would agree right now that there isn't an obvious sign of a bottoming out and a recovery taking place. So in this context then, these packages raise serious questions about social justice, and as a result of that we have a range of new social movements, if you like, around things like UK Uncut and Occupy Wall Street, which are demanding what seem in some ways quite moderate action to take banks back into the public domain in a more proactive way, or even to let banks fail. So those are the main, just checking my notes, those are my main comments about repercussions. We still have a lot of questions about suitable government responses to crisis. Governments have generally remained very passive, at least in the West, in regards to dealing with crisis. We have a very unstable and rebellious civil society at the moment, and we have a banking system that remains minimally reformed and minimally regulated, that remains very conservative in how it allocates its money.